Like every war in history, the First World War was the collective product of a multitude of causes. Nations and certainly continents do not go to war over a single issue. Long term systemic circumstances, as well as short term causes, eventually provoke conflict. The long term causes of the First World War included such phenomenon as arms buildups, nationalism, imperialism, international competition, internal conflicts, and military alliances. Just one of these circumstances, and perhaps several of them, would not necessarily provoke war, but the combined effect of these phenomenon presented a volatile situation that needed little to spark large conflict. It is often said that in the summer of 1914, Europe was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. That is a correct assessment. Conflict was not inevitable, and certainly not necessary, but the continent was teetering on broader conflict, and the spark needed to cause the explosion tragically came in the fateful summer of 1914. This lecture will focus particularly on the year 1914 and the short-term causes of the First World War. Despite the tense situation the continent was in at the beginning of the 20th century, Europe was still living in a prosperous epoch often called La Belle Époque, the beautiful era. Europe was the center of the world in trade, finance, culture, stability, growth, technology, and the arts. The World Fair in Paris in 1900 showcased the triumphs of the Second Industrial Revolution and the grand spectacle that was European civilization. Many Americans came to Paris in the 19th century because the City of Lights was the place to study art, dance, language, and culture. French was the language of high culture and international diplomacy. Paris had been reconstructed and rebuilt in the 19th century and was in many ways the envy of the world. Its monuments, fountains, wide boulevards, and tree-lined sidewalks made it the place to be. Sidewalk cafes and strolls along the Seine River were part of the mystique and romance of the city. The internal tensions of Europe's empires and the simmering conflicts between European states seemed very far away. The confidence and optimism that was common to Europe in 1914 is evident in the words of notable English historian Arnold Toynbee. He wrote, quote, "It was expected that life throughout the world would become more rational, more humane, and more democratic, and that slowly, but surely, political democracy would produce greater social justice. We had also expected that the progress of science and technology would make mankind richer, and that this increasing wealth would gradually spread from a minority to a majority. We had expected that all this would happen peacefully. In fact, we thought that mankind's course was set for an earthly paradise." Unquote. The optimism of the Belle Époque can be seen in the predominant artistic movement of the time, Impressionism. Impressionism rejected the stark realism of previous movements and emphasized ethereal, almost dreamlike images that were not characterized by definition and cared little about reality. Natural settings with light and color replaced an art studio's distinct and sharp details. French Impressionist Camille Pissarro summarized the movement when he wrote, quote, "Don't proceed according to rules and principles, but paint what you observe and feel. Paint generously and unhesitatingly, for it is best not to lose the first impression." Unquote. Impressionism emphasized soft, natural settings and colors, and post-impressionism, even more so, encouraged subjective feelings and emotional realities. Whereas Impressionism emphasized the impression the artist could see, its subsequent movement, Post-Impressionism, emphasized the impression the artist felt. The French artist Claude Monet produced several works that typified the Impressionist movement. In this 1875 work entitled Woman with a Parasol, Monet presents the simple light image of a woman with an umbrella and a young boy. The colors are soft, and so is the setting. Everything exudes lightness and calm. Something similar is seen here in Monet's work, Impression Soleil Levant. Solitary figures maneuver a small boat in what seems to be a harbor. There may be busyness and complexity behind them, but they are leaving it behind them. A setting sun gives the viewer a scene of peace, serenity, and settledness. Impressionistic artists loved nature and incorporated dynamic landforms into their works. This is Monet's 1885 work, The Cliffs at Étretat. Once again, there is only enough definition for us to understand the subject of the painting, but the lines are soft and the water almost looks real and active because of the blended colors. Impressionistic artists demonstrated an aversion to the complexities and ugliness of modern urbanized industrialized life. When modern industry was included into a piece, it often appears in the distance, far from immediate sight. This piece is entitled Sunset at Ivry. Although it is clear that there are factories in the distance belching toxic smoke into the air, the impressionistic artist Armand Guillaumin intentionally blurs the smog with the sunset, turning something ugly into something almost attractive. It is not uncommon to see elements of escapism in impressionistic works, a desire to escape from the ugliness and realities of modern industrialized life and find a more beautiful world. This work by Camille Pissarro depicts the busyness of a boulevard in the Montmartre section of Paris. Despite its congestion, rush, and hurry, these stressors fade into the background, and even a congested boulevard becomes escapist and attractive. Impressionism's successor, Post-Impressionism, expanded on Impressionism's themes and intentionally lost even more definition and outline. Only faintly can a viewer make out the small town and brilliant stars in Vincent van Gogh's famous work, The Starry Night. Even more than Impressionism, the effect of the painting is not what is seen by the viewer, but what is felt by the viewer. While the tensions that were engulfing Europe and the conflicts that were simmering were not immediately evident in Impressionistic works, a closer look did reveal them. Norwegian painter Edvard Munch seemed to capture much of the anxiety and unsettledness of the continent in his famous 1893 work, The Scream. Highly impressionistic, The Scream depicts a solitary individual shrieking with anxiety, even as the world that surrounds him seems to be oblivious to his angst. The work is an effective symbol of the time period. The world seems to be at peace, but completely unaware of the horror that is about to engulf the continent in 1914. Optimism was not only exhibited in the art of the Belle Époque, it could also be found in late 19th century Christian theology. A new liberal theology, particularly prevalent in Germany, came to dominate European seminaries and universities. Old Calvinist and Lutheran doctrines that emphasized the depravity and sinfulness of man, the divinity of Jesus, the atonement of Christ's crucifixion, and the hope of the resurrection of Jesus were largely abandoned. In short, European Christianity came to abandon the belief in the exclusivity of Christianity as a means for human salvation. Modern and liberal Christianity came to emphasize the distance of God, the nobility of humanity, and the capacity of man to do good works and create a perfect world. The authority and inspiration of the Bible was rejected, and truth came to be defined well beyond the historic barriers of historic Christianity. Early 20th century liberal theology was yet another example of the optimism that characterized Europeans and their belief in their ability to create an ideal and perfect world. Contrasts to the liberal theology of the turn of the century were few, but one prominent voice was Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon was a Reformed Baptist preacher who continued to teach the traditional Calvinist doctrines of sin, the depravity of man, predestination, and salvation. Spurgeon was a prolific preacher, teacher, and writer, and was so popular in Victorian London that he became known as the Prince of Preachers. Spurgeon's evangelical message prompted enormous growth at his Metropolitan Tabernacle in London. Listeners were attracted to his traditional gospel message, particularly because his traditional message stood in stark contrast with modernist theology. The First World War would have a significant impact on Christian theology in the 20th century, and it remained to be seen if the positive view of man espoused by modernist theology or the depraved view of man espoused by evangelicals like Spurgeon would determine the future of Christianity in Europe. Although the continent was not aware of it, the general peace and prosperity that had predominated in Europe for most of the 19th century was about to be so strained and damaged that it would plummet the continent into a war like it had never seen. Much of the tension that exploded in 1914 was particularly escalating in the area of Europe known as the Balkans. Named after a range of mountains in Bulgaria, the Balkans is an extensive peninsula in southeast Europe surrounded by the Adriatic, Ionian, Aegean, and Black Seas. The Balkans have always been a heavily contested area of Europe, with the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the Ottoman Empire exercising marginal control over the region and often struggling to suppress dissent and quell rebellion. By 1914, the Ottoman Empire had exercised dominion over the Balkans for 500 years. But it was clear by 1914 that the Ottoman Empire was in decline and slowly withering due to a stagnant economy, multiple defeats in war, and boiling internal dissent by groups seeking their own national identity. The state of Serbia fought a protracted revolution against the Ottomans from 1804 to 1815 and finally secured its independence as the Principality of Serbia in 1815, a constitutional monarchy. In 1878, after the conclusion of one of the many wars fought between Russia and the Ottomans, the Treaty of San Stefano also created an independent Bulgaria and Romania and expanded the land holdings of Serbia and Montenegro. The newly formed states in the Balkans were pleased to have their independence and own state, but they also saw the potential to expand their states at the expense of the fading Ottoman Empire. The initial agreement at San Stefano was finalized by the major powers of the continent at the Congress of Berlin in 1878. It is a bitter irony that the great powers recommitted themselves to diplomatic resolution of their disputes, once again affirming the concert of Europe at the Congress of Berlin, but this would be the last moment that all the great powers seemed to be on the same page and able to work together. Questions surrounding the Balkan territories seemed to be peacefully negotiated. Romania became independent. Serbia and Montenegro were granted full independence. Austria-Hungary gained control of Bosnia. Britain took possession of Cyprus. Bulgaria was made semi-independent. Macedonia was placed under the control of the Ottoman Empire. Yet, after the Congress was concluded, each power felt like it had been cheated of something that should have been theirs. As soon as the sessions were concluded, the suspicions and the resentments commenced would provoke a series of escalating crises in the coming decades. Also under the terms of the Congress of Berlin, the Ottoman Empire lost control of the region of Bosnia in the Balkans. Austria-Hungary was granted rights of occupation and administration. Large crowds, particularly in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo, protested the Austrian occupation and had to be put down with imperial force. Although many Bosnians welcomed the rule by Austria rather than the Ottomans, many also fled, leading to a mass migration. Many Bosnians migrated to neighboring Serbia, creating a population removed from their homeland and eagerly desiring the unification of Serbia's Serbs with Bosnia's Serbs into a larger and greater Kingdom of Serbia. Austria-Hungary, however, had contrary plans. Austria planned to turn Bosnia into a, quote, model colony, unquote, through social and cultural initiatives designed to promote a separate Bosnian identity detached from Serbia. Austria's initiatives in Bosnia only inflamed the nationalist passions of Bosnian Serbs living in exile in Serbia and their dreams of a greater Kingdom of Serbia. The great powers of Europe met in 1884, once again in Berlin, for the Berlin Conference. The purpose of the conference was to discuss boundaries and the partitioning of Africa. The growing international competition and rivalries were evident even when questions not related to European territories were being discussed. The cooperation and goodwill that seemed to be on display at the Congress of Berlin immediately started to break down the very next year in 1879. Fearing the ambition and intentions of Russia, Chancellor Bismarck contracted a defensive alliance with neighboring Austria-Hungary. Both empires promised to come to each other's aid in the event of attack by Russia. The defensive alliance was secret, but the move away from a balance of power in Europe towards opposing camps of alliances was starting to form. In 1882, the dual alliance became the Triple Alliance. Italy sought an ally in the event of war with France and found it with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy would always prove to be the restless member of the Triple Alliance, even to the point of negotiating with non-alliance members in the event that Italy chose to depart the Triple Alliance. Once war, in fact, did break out, it would not be long before Italy switched sides and abandoned the Triple Alliance. The major powers of Central Europe were now allied together in a defensive alliance that made their neighbors jittery and provoked them into seeking their own alliances. Adding to the tension in the Balkans, the vassal states of the Ottoman Empire continued to sense the Sultan's weakness to hold his empire together and endeavored to exert their sovereignty in the region. By the end of the 19th century, Bulgaria was a self-governing state within the Ottoman Empire, but eager to incorporate more Bulgars and more territory into its state. A series of conflicts between Bulgaria and its neighbors prompted once again questions of Austrian and Russian influence in the area and additional signs of weakness from the Ottoman Empire. Bulgaria retained its self-governance by the beginning of the 20th century and at last its full independence in 1908. Fearing the power of the Russian state near its territory, Bulgaria decided to side with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire during World War I. Although he was positioning Germany alongside allies with interests contrary to Imperial Russia, Bismarck remained gravely concerned about an attack on Germany from Russia in the east. Therefore, even as Bismarck was publicly courting other allies, he also took the step to contract a secret treaty known as the Reassurance Treaty with Russia. It was a promise to each other not to fight each other in war unless Russia attacked Austria or Germany attacked France. The promise was tenuous, with both parties remaining suspicious of each other, but the agreement does reveal the level of concern in Germany regarding the size of Imperial Russia's army and losing its political and military domination of Central Europe. The agreement only lasted 3 years and was not renewed once the Kaiser dropped Bismarck from his chancellorship. Thereafter, distrust would only grow further between Germany and Russia. Russia found a more eager ally in Germany's traditional enemy and neighbor to the west, France. Russia had more foreign policy interests in common with France. Particularly, both feared Germany's imperial ambitions and were looking for more guarantees of security. The Franco-Russian alliance fashioned between the two states in the early 1890s featured large financial loans from France to Russia and a cooperation between the two nations' armed forces. The cooperation between the two general staffs grew closer into the 20th century. The strength of the Franco-Russian alliance meant that if there was a war between Germany and one of these powers, then Germany would have to fight both of them, a war on two fronts, east and west, and therefore, of necessity, not just a local war, but a much wider war. Simultaneous to the fashioning and refashioning of alliances at the turn of the century was a rapidly accelerating naval arms race between Great Britain and Imperial Germany. The Kaiser was always envious of the size and scale of Britain's navy, and he was determined to elevate Germany's imperial navy to the same scale. German Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz pushed for the construction of more ships for the high seas fleet that would amount to a fleet in being, a fleet not necessarily for war, but rather for intimidation that would force Britain to back down in the face of commensurate German naval power. A series of German naval bills funded the construction of new ships. Britain responded in kind, determined to retain naval supremacy in the world. Britain constructed HMS Dreadnought as the first modern battleship, and then proceeded to construct others. In the years before World War I, Germany began concentrating less on surface ships of war and more on anti-merchant fleet craft, particularly U-boats, that is, submarines. Germany's raids against sea commerce would prove a critical factor in the coming World War. A shocking event in May of 1904 further bore witness to the instability that seemed rife in the Balkans and the restlessness most evident in Serbia. A group of royal Serbian officers organized the assassination of their own king and queen. King Alexander I and Queen Draga of Serbia had angered a significant portion in the government and in the military. At one point, the king had abolished the constitution and disbanded the Senate. But what particularly infuriated the conspirators was the king's support of Austria at the expense of relations with Russia. Early in the morning of May 29, 1904, a group of officers broke into the royal palace and found the king and queen hiding in a wardrobe. They were shot, the bodies were mutilated, and their corpses were thrown out a window onto a pile of manure. Some say, as the king was holding on to the edge of the window, his fingers were chopped off, plummeting him to his death. A new dynasty was established in Serbia, a Serbia that gravitated now towards antagonism with Austria and alliance with Russia. The coup, instigated by a limited number of conspirators, also besmirched the international reputation of Serbia, with many, particularly in Austria, labeling the Serbs as a nation of violent thugs and barbarians. Sensing the growing international tension, Great Britain was eager to shore up its defenses and remain confident it would not be overextended around the world without allies. To that end, in 1902, Britain signed a treaty of alliance with Japan. Britain thought it would be wise to have an ally in the Pacific region in the event of war. Japan was interested in securing an alliance with a European power, even as tensions between Japan and Russia began to swell over territories and control of the northern Pacific. Britain's alliance with Japan would prove useful during the First World War, but when the alliance broke down after the war, the repercussions would be significant for several difficult years ahead. In 1904, war broke out, not in Europe, but on the opposite side of the globe. The Empire of Japan, which had emerged out of isolation 3 decades earlier, was eager to assert its modern navy and exercise a new authority over its Pacific neighbors. Standing in its way was the vast Russian Empire that stretched across Asia and had no interest in its upstart Japanese neighbor becoming masters in the Pacific. Nevertheless, Japan struck Russia first and proceeded to demonstrate over the next year how superior its armed forces were compared to the Russians. Defeat in the Russo-Japanese War was not just a setback for Russia, but it very much felt like humiliation. It was the first time that an Asian power had defeated a European power in the modern world. In the coming decades, the Tsar was eager to prove Russia's defeat at the hands of Japan was a fluke, and by no means would Russia be embarrassed again. It was bad enough to be defeated in the Pacific. Allowing Russia to be marginalized by European hands was unthinkable. Despite the long-standing historic tensions between the nations that extended even into the 20th century, Britain and France at long last threw off their ancient antagonisms and drew closer as allies at the beginning of the 20th century. A series of secret agreements were signed in London in 1904 between the French and English that promised to respect the colonial dominions of each and draw the two nations together with obvious negative suspicions directed against Imperial Germany. Known as the Entente Cordiale, the points of agreement were small, but they were yet another example of two nations coming together in Europe in the interest of self-protection. International tension increased in 1911 as a result of what became known as the First Moroccan Crisis. France held sway over a large number of colonies in northern and western Africa and hoped to increase its sway over Morocco as well. Seeking to challenge French power in northern Africa, Kaiser Wilhelm toured Tangier, Morocco in 1905 and publicly announced his support for the Moroccan Sultan and his sovereignty. The Sultan felt emboldened by the Kaiser's words and rejected a series of proposed French reforms for his government. The Sultan also called for an international conference during which other states, besides France, could propose reforms for the Moroccan Principality. The subsequent Algeciras Conference resolved the dispute in 1906, but the Kaiser's provocations drew France closer to Britain, Russia, Spain, and the United States, and left Germany with only Austria-Hungary as its ally. As an indicator of how caustic the relationship was becoming between Serbia and Austria, Serbia continued to distance herself economically from Austria by expanding trade networks with Germany and France. In an effort to clip Serbia's intentions towards economic independence, Austria imposed a customs blockade on Serbian pork. The measure was intended to stifle Serbian economic growth and became dubbed as the so-called Pig War. In the end, the Austrian blockade did not work, and Serbia found other markets at which it could sell its abundance of pork, but nevertheless, the Pig War was yet another dividing point between Serbia and Austria, another wound in an increasingly toxic relationship. As an additional indicator that the growing power of Germany was of great concern to other European states, Britain and Russia saw the need to come together in the summer of 1907 to resolve their own disputes and block German ambitions in the Middle East. British and Russian imperial interests had clashed repeatedly in and around Persia, Afghanistan, and Tibet. While Britain and Russia were squabbling, Germany hoped to take advantage of their divisions and form a closer alliance with the Ottoman Empire by building a railroad from Berlin all the way to Baghdad. By putting their disputes aside, the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 put pressure on the Ottoman Empire to focus more on its immediate borders and interests and to think twice before drawing closer to Germany and ignoring British and Russian spheres of influence in Lower Asia. Looking with increased suspicion against the Triple Alliance, the remaining dominant states of Europe came together in 1907 to form the Triple Entente. Entente in French refers to an agreement or friendship. The Triple Entente was based on the Anglo-Russian Convention and the Entente Cordiale. It was an easy step for Great Britain, France, and Russia to come together as a three-party alliance to match the three states that composed the Triple Alliance. By 1907, Europe was already divided into the armed camps of the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, and Italy, and the Triple Entente, Great Britain, France, and Russia. In the years to come before the war, remaining states were often forced or dragged into one of the sides, with few states managing to remain independent and neutral throughout the conflict. Besides losing ever-increasingly large chunks of its formerly expansive and formidable empire, the Ottoman Empire demonstrated its weakness to the world in its growing inability to manage its internal politics, restless ethnic groups, and the demands of the young for reform, constitutionalism, and an end to the absolute power of the Sultan. The Young Turks were one of many, but the most dynamic, of these movements. Capitalizing on the weakness of the Sultanate, the Young Turks effected a revolution in the Ottoman Empire in 1908 that reduced the Sultan to a ceremonial figurehead, restored a constitution, and reconvened parliament. While the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 was advertised as a constitutional democratic revolution, in reality, a small group within the Young Turks Party, known as the Committee for Union and Progress, established a military dictatorship with the help of government bureaucrats and army officers. The discontented and diverse groups that composed the Ottoman Kingdom were under no illusion that they had been granted political power or influence. The Committee for Union and Progress clique within the Young Turks would lead the Ottoman Empire into the war alongside Germany and Austria in a faltering bid to reduce the power of Russia on the borders of Asia and Europe. In the end, the Young Turks would fail to reform their nation, fail to establish a constitutional government, fail to win the war, and soon fail to even hold on to their increasingly brittle empire. Tensions between the great powers flared again in 1908 amidst controversy surrounding Bosnia in the Balkans. Bosnia had historically been a part of the Ottoman Empire, but since 1878 the territory had been under the authority of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Unexpectedly and unilaterally, Austria-Hungary announced the complete annexation of the territory away from the Ottoman Empire in 1908. The land grab angered the other major powers of Europe, particularly neighboring Serbia. The move coincided with the declaration of Bulgarian independence. Although the move by Austria was endorsed in a treaty the following year in 1909, nevertheless the relationship between Austria and neighboring Slavic states was significantly damaged, particularly with Serbia and Russia. Serbian nationalists seeking a greater Serbia, uniting all southern Slavs and Bosnian Serbs who were outraged by the move, were both determined to commit violent acts to oppose Austrian dominion in the Balkans. Even though Italy was a critical member of the Triple Alliance, her commitment to Germany and Austria continued to waver into the 20th century. Despite Austria being her defensive ally, Italy fretted over Austria's military strength and resented her control over the neighboring Balkans. Italy came to see Russia's intimidation of Austria not as motivation to remain Austria's ally, but rather as a fear to exploit for Italy's interests. In 1909, at the Castle Ragonnigi, Italy contracted a secret agreement with Russia that acknowledged Russia's interests in the Turkish Straits, while Italy's interests in North Africa were recognized by Russia. The bargain signaled Italy's restlessness as an ally of Austria, and the possibility Italy would be willing to switch sides and alliances if it was in her best interests. A moment of significantly increased tension occurred in 1911 in the second crisis that centered on the French protectorate of Morocco. In 1911, a rebellion broke out against the Moroccan Sultan, and the French dispatched troops to protect the interests and quell the revolt. Carelessly willing to provoke an incident and escalate tensions, Germany dispatched the gunboat SMS Panther to the harbor of Agadir in Morocco under the guise of protecting German citizens and property. The thinly veiled intimidation attracted the ire of both the French and British. The Imperial German government quickly backed down, claiming no territorial rights in Morocco, but Germany demanded compensation elsewhere in Africa. The French and German governments came to an understanding with French sovereign rights in Morocco recognized, and Germany was granted a small portion of the French Congo to add to its African dominions. The blustering move by the Kaiser only drove England and France closer together, and Germany felt even more vulnerable and isolated than before. Like many in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, Italy could sense the decline and weakness of the fading Ottoman Empire. Sensing the time was ripe to snatch a piece of the Ottoman Empire, Italy moved against regions in North Africa that would come to be called Libya. The Italians were right. Ottoman forces usually collapsed under assault, and Italy moved at will in North Africa. The Italo-Turkish War was the first to feature aircraft used as reconnaissance, aircraft used to drop explosives on enemy targets, and the first time in warfare aircraft were shot down from the ground. Italy made moderate gains for its colonial empire, but the lasting impact of the war was the inspiration it gave to restless, nascent states within the Ottoman Empire, dreaming of their own sovereignty and independence. Sensing the weakness of the Ottoman Empire, 4 Balkan states came together in 1912 to form a league of opposition. Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro each shared the same Eastern Orthodox Christianity and a mutual suspicion and contempt for the Ottoman Empire. Feeling their growing strength and the obvious weakness of the Ottoman Sultan, the Balkan League states provoked war against the Ottoman Kingdom in 1912. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 were a series of 2 conflicts that pitted the Balkan League members, Greece, Serbia, Montenegro, and Bulgaria, against the Ottoman Empire, and then against each other. The Balkan Wars were wars of opportunism, with states endeavoring to expand their influence at their neighbors' expense. The First Balkan War witnessed the unity of the Balkan League members and led to a quick defeat of the Ottoman forces. The Ottomans lost their European provinces. In the Second Balkan War, Bulgaria fought against its League allies from the year before and also against Romania. Overwhelmed, Bulgaria was defeated, but thankful to barely lose any of its holdings. The Balkan Wars were small and locally confined to the Balkan Peninsula, but the two conflicts served as practice for the greater conflict that would break out the following year in, once again, the same region, the Balkans. The tinderbox that was now Europe awaited only a spark to ignite. That spark would be struck in June of 1914 with the visit of the Austrian heir to the province of Bosnia. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was not the son of Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph. The emperor's only son had committed suicide with his mistress in 1889, and the emperor's brother died in 1896, thus placing the son of the emperor's brother, the emperor's nephew, Franz Ferdinand, as heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Franz Ferdinand was born in Graz, Austria in 1863. The Archduke grew up in a world of wealth and aristocracy, and, because of the frosty relationship between him and the emperor, the Archduke enjoyed getting away from the royal court in Vienna and extensive travel. He even circumnavigated the world between 1892 and 1893. He was an accomplished trophy hunter, acquiring 100,000 mounts over his extensive hunting career. In 1894, Franz Ferdinand met Countess Sophie Chotek and fell deeply in love. The match created a stir with the emperor and the royal court, as Sophie was, although aristocracy, not of the royal bloodline. Sophie was shunned at court and disregarded by the emperor, but Franz Ferdinand was determined to marry his beloved, and finally the emperor gave his permission to the match, although with conditions, including that Sophie would never become Empress of Austria, even if her husband ascended to the throne. Any children would likewise be denied succession rights. Sophie would also be forbidden from sharing her husband's rank, title, or privileges, and be forbidden from riding in the royal carriage or sitting in the royal box in theaters next to her husband. Franz Ferdinand assented to the long list of demands and married Sophie Chotek on July 1, 1900. The emperor did not attend the wedding, and neither did any of the Archduke's siblings. Even after their marriage, the court in Vienna continued to shun and ostracize Sophie, and the already antagonistic relationship between the Archduke and his uncle, the Emperor, grew even more strained. The Archduke and Sophie raised 3 children together, but because of the unkindness they experienced at court, the couple liked to frequently leave Vienna and travel. They frequently traveled to Germany, where the Kaiser went out of his way to treat Sophie as the royalty she was, not in her own country. The Archduke also traveled extensively across the Austro-Hungarian Empire that would one day be his empire to rule over. He was aware of the restless and multiple nationalities that seethed under Austrian rule. He recognized nationalist impulses could not be ignored forever. He seems to have been working on a more federal system for the empire he would implement in the future that would give greater voice and representation to the suppressed nationalist groups. The Archduke announced a trip to the restless state of Bosnia in the empire for the summer of 1914. His visit there was both political and personal. The Archduke hoped a visit to the Bosnian capital Sarajevo would demonstrate the goodwill of the monarchy towards the region of the empire as he observed military maneuvers. He also sought to take a vacation with Sophie that could serve as an early celebration of their pending wedding anniversary. The Archduke and his wife departed Austria by train and arrived in a suburb of Sarajevo on June 27th. They were received warmly at a dinner and did some shopping for their children. The Austrian monarchy underestimated the level of discontent in the empire and just how restless the Kingdom of Serbia was. The kingdom had secured its independence from the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, but not all Serbs lived in the Kingdom of Serbia. Many Serbs still lived in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, particularly in the empire's province of Bosnia-Herzegovina. While the Austrian Empire recognized the Serbian kingdom, the Austrians had little interest in ceding large tracts of land, including Bosnia, to the Serbian kingdom so that all Serbs could live in the same realm. The Habsburg court in Vienna continued to look with suspicion and derision against its fiery neighbor in the south. The dream of a greater Serbian kingdom remained strong into the 20th century, however, and fueled nationalist and even terrorist organizations. A multitude of Austrian officials had been targeted with assassination attempts in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1911, the terrorist society known as the Black Hand was established and dedicated themselves to the creation of a greater Serbia, a Serbia greater in land and population than currently existed and would incorporate all southern Slavs in the Balkans, particularly those in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Terrorist actions would be the strategy of the Black Hand to achieve its goals. The terrorist group, Young Bosnia, likewise held the same vision of a greater Serbia, but its members were composed of Bosnian Serbs, Serbs who lived outside of Serbia and in the Bosnian province of the Austro-Hungarian. Serbs who lived outside of Serbia and in the Bosnian province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Both groups were willing to use violence to create a greater Serbian kingdom. Both members of the Black Hand and Young Bosnia traveled from Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, to the province of Bosnia. June 28th was a significant holiday for Serbia, as is the feast of St. Vitus. The holiday commemorates the 1389 Battle of Kosovo against the Ottomans, in which the Sultan was assassinated in his tent by a Serb. Hearing of the Archduke's visit to Sarajevo, multiple members of the Black Hand and Young Bosnia traveled to Sarajevo to intercept the visit of the Archduke. The group included Muhammad Mehmedbezik, Neđeljko Kabrinović, and Gavrilo Princip. They made their way from Belgrade to Sarajevo and arrived in the Bosnian capital in early June. Weapons, including cyanide capsules, grenades, bombs, and pistols, were soon delivered to the plotters in Sarajevo as well. On June 28th, the Archduke and his wife departed from the suburb and arrived at the Sarajevo train station. They were met there and greeted by the local governor. A motorcade of 6 cars departed along with the Archduke and his wife. After a brief review of a military barracks, the motorcade proceeded to the city center. The Archduke and his wife were riding in a 1911 Graf and Stift Bois de Boulogne touring car with the top down. The Archduke and his wife rode in the rear seat, and the front seat carried the governor and a driver. The motorcade proceeded from the barracks review and was headed to the Sarajevo town hall. Large crowds lined the route of the motorcade. Security was light, only being entrusted to approximately 60 Sarajevo policemen. The car approached the first assassin along the route, Muhammad Mehmedbezik. He intended to throw a bomb at the passing car, but lost his nerve and failed to act. At 10:10 a.m., as the car approached the Kamirja Bridge, the second assassin, Neđeljko Kabrinović, threw a bomb at the Archduke's car. The bomb bounced off the rear of the car, fell to the ground, and detonated beneath the next car in the motorcade, wounding nearly 20 people. Kabrinović jumped into the nearby Majalka River to escape, but the river was only a few inches deep due to the hot, dry summer. Kabrinović quickly took his dose of cyanide, but the poison had lost its toxicity and only made him violently sick. Police jumped into the river as well and dragged Kabrinović out of the river and took him into custody. Witnessing the failed bombing, the motorcade accelerated significantly and proceeded by the remaining assassins on its way to the town hall. The remaining assassins believed they had missed their opportunity to act. The motorcade arrived at the town hall, where the Archduke interrupted the mayor's speech and yelled at him, "I came here on a visit, and I am greeted with bombs? It is outrageous." The remaining schedule for the day was scrapped, and instead the couple decided to relocate to the hospital to visit the bystanders wounded in the bomb attack. They returned to their car, and the motorcade resumed back on the route from whence they had just traveled. Gavrilo Princip, who had earlier missed his opportunity to shoot the Archduke when the motorcade sped by, now took up a different position on the road along the river, hoping the Archduke's motorcade would make the return journey right in front of him. Princip was born in 1894 in western Bosnia to a poor Serb family. At the age of 13, he had been sent to Sarajevo for education. In 1911, Princip joined Young Bosnia, the terrorist society dedicated to unifying all southern Slavs in the empire into a greater Serbia. Princip was expelled from his school in Sarajevo for his anti-Austrian demonstrations and walked all the way to Belgrade in order to continue his education. He also endeavored to join the Serbian army, but was deemed too small and weak and was rejected. Princip was inspired by a string of assassination attempts against Austrian officials in Bosnia and resolved to likewise make his mark for Serbian nationalism. Princip moved in front of Schiller's Delicatessen, a food shop located near the Latin Bridge, and waited for another opportunity against the Archduke. Before long, the motorcade indeed moved along the road beside the river. The motorcade was on its way to the hospital, but it was supposed to stay on the road along the river rather than turning and having to drive through the crowded city center. The driver of the motorcade, however, was never informed of the change. When the first two cars in the motorcade turned right near the Latin Bridge, the Archduke's driver also followed them. Yet as soon as the Archduke's car made the turn, the governor traveling with the royal couple yelled out to stop, as they were going the wrong way. The driver stopped the car, but when he endeavored to put the car in reverse and back up, the car stalled very close to the position on the street where Princip was standing. With the imperial couple stuck in a stalled car without a roof covering, Princip took the few steps up to the car. Princip drew a Belgian-made handgun, a Fabrique Nationale model 1910 .38 caliber pistol, and fired 2 shots. Princip fired at point-blank range and shot the Archduke in the jugular vein with his first shot. The second shot struck the Duchess in the abdomen. Princip then tried to shoot himself, but was quickly tackled by police and arrested. Sophie fell unconscious and collapsed into her husband's lap. Franz Ferdinand also lost consciousness, even as he implored his wife, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Live for our children." As the Archduke drifted off, he muttered, "Es ist nichts," German for "it is nothing," believing his gunshot wound to be insignificant. In a bitter irony, not only was the Archduke's wound much more than nothing, so were the repercussions of the gunshot. The imperial couple were pronounced dead by 11:30 a.m. on June 28, 1914, at the governor's residence. The bodies of the imperial couple were transported back to Vienna. The disrespect and contempt the royal court directed at the couple during their life only continued into their death. Upon hearing of the assassination of the couple, Emperor Franz Joseph remarked to his daughter, "For me, it is a relief from a great worry." The couple's funeral was a limited affair, with other European royalty disinvited. The couple's 3 children were excluded from the few public ceremonies. The officer corps was forbidden from saluting the funeral train, and the children of the slain couple were asked to pay for the funeral. Even Sophie's coffin was slanted downwards to emphasize her lower status than her husband, and her gloves were placed on top of her coffin, a practice usually indicating a lady in waiting, that is, a servant to royalty, not royalty itself. Because the Duchess was not royalty, it was forbidden that the couple be buried together in the Habsburg royal vault. Thus, the couple was interned in the royal vault at Arstetten Castle, a former summer home of the Habsburg monarchs. The couple are interned in the tomb at the castle, along with members of their family today. At the scene of the assassination, chaos broke out. The crowd reacted in horror, and several members of the Black Hand were immediately arrested. Princip had endeavored to shoot himself after the assassination, but he was quickly seized by police and arrested. All members of the assassination squad were eventually arrested, including those who helped to transport weapons and plans from Serbia to Bosnia. Anti-Serb riots broke out in Sarajevo, Bosnia, and other parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, revealing not all Bosnians sought to be joined with the greater kingdom of Serbia, and Bosnia truly was divided along nationalistic lines. Princip immediately began talking upon interrogation. He was a Bosnian Serb nationalist and irredentist who wanted the Austrian occupation of Bosnia to end and Bosnia, particularly Bosnian Serbs, to be reunited with the Kingdom of Serbia. Austro-Hungarian authorities prosecuted the assassination conspirators and charged most of them with high treason. The trials did not take place until October 1914. At his trial, Princip declared, quote, "I am a Yugoslav nationalist, and I believe in unification of all South Slavs in whatever form of state, and that it be free of Austria," unquote. When asked how he intended to achieve this goal, Princip responded, "By means of terror." The conspirators clearly exonerated any role the government or military of Serbia had in the assassination. They wanted the court to believe that they had acted alone. But the court was determined to tie the assassins to Serbian authorities to make the assassination into a state act rather than a personal act. Despite a lack of evidence, the court declared, quote, "It is proved by the evidence that both Narodna Odbrana and military circles in the Kingdom of Serbia in charge of the espionage service collaborated in the outrage," unquote. Serbia refused several requests to closely investigate the case and continued to refuse. Austria-Hungary, therefore, took up the investigation, further embittering Serbia. The sentences for the conspirators ranged from prison terms to death sentences to acquittals. Princip was sentenced to 20 years in prison, partly out of respect for his age. He was 19 at the time. Princip would not live to see the end of the war. He died in prison from tuberculosis on April 28, 1918. 2 days after the assassination, Austria-Hungary and Germany both advised Serbia that it should open an investigation into the assassination, and particularly investigate the role its intelligence service and Army Corps military channels had to do with the assassination. Serbia refused. The assassination of the Archduke touched off what would become known as the July Crisis, a series of diplomatic events and negotiations that eventually led to the First World War. Although the slain Archduke was not particularly popular in even the Austro-Hungarian Empire, his assassination certainly could not be overlooked. A growing number of voices, sometimes called the War Party, started to speak more aggressively against Serbia and did not shy away from calling for war. One of these War Party voices was Austrian Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold, who believed he could bend Serbia to his will with a strong, forceful response. Between June 29th and July 1st, Berchtold and Franz Konrad von Hotzendorf, chairman of the General Staff of the Austrian Army, debated the needed response to the assassination and measures to be taken against Serbia. Hotzendorf wanted to declare war immediately against Serbia, but Berchtold wanted to issue a demand to Serbia that all terrorists and anti-Austria-Hungarian groups be disbanded in their nation. Additional Austrian officials wanted to wait for more results from a criminal inquiry, but the dithering gradually led Berchtold to agree with Hotzendorf on the imperative for war. Even the Emperor Franz Joseph also saw the necessity to launch war against Serbia, but only wanted to do so with a guarantee of German support. Many in the War Party held an idealized vision of the past and believed the weaknesses of the Austro-Hungarian Empire could be overcome with a war that quickly crushed Serbia. Members of the German General Staff came to agree with their Austrian counterparts and advised Kaiser William II that Austria should act quickly with war against Serbia. To make certain of Germany's support for Austrian actions, Berchtold dispatched his chief of staff and private secretary, Alexander Hoyos, to Berlin for July 5th and 6th. Hoyos expressed Austria's concerns that Russia was amassing an alliance of eastern states, including Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Montenegro, and Serbia to gang up on Austria and dismember the empire. Hoyos recommended to the German Kaiser that Austria and Germany should act first and quickly form their own alliance with Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire against Russia. Hoyos also delivered a personal letter from Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph to the German Kaiser, advocating for the end of Serbia as a political power in the Balkans. Kaiser William gave Hoyos full assurance that Austria could count on Germany's full support. This statement of support became known as the blank check, that is, Germany pledging to fully support Austria regardless of what was needed to move against Serbia up to and including war. Before war was declared by Austria against Serbia, however, Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza persuaded the Austrian Council of Ministers that stated demands should be issued first against Serbia to provide a judicial basis for war. Among the Council of Ministers, only Tisza worried about Russian reaction and mobilization for war, and that an Austrian-Serbian war would not remain small and localized. In Berlin, the German Chancellor, Theobald Bethmann Hollweg, continued to express concerns over the growing size of Russia and the nascent naval alliance it was forming with Britain. Worried about a possible encirclement of Germany from Russia in the east and Britain and France in the west, Hollweg as well pushed for war and the present moment as the time to strike. Austria continued to delay, however, much to the growing impatience of the Germans. Birchall was disappointed to learn on July 13th the investigators actually had not found any complicity by the Serbian government in the assassination of the Archduke. The Black Hand terrorist organization had acted on its own. Thus, some of the pretext for Austria to declare war against Serbia was eroded. On July 18th, responding to rumors that Austria-Hungary was about to issue an ultimatum against Serbia, Serbia's Prime Minister Nikola Pasic declared his nation would not accept any measures compromising his nation's sovereignty. Austria did not issue its ultimatum against Serbia until July 23, 1914, a full 3 weeks after the assassination, when international sympathy for Austria over the assassination had already begun to wane. The issued ultimatum by Austria against Serbia was intentionally harsh and designed to be rejected, giving Austria the final pretext it sought to declare war against Serbia. Under the terms of the July ultimatum, Serbia was required to suppress all publications that incited hatred of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and its territorial dominions. All Serbian national organizations were to be dissolved. All Serbian school books were to be purged of any propaganda directed against Austria-Hungary. All Serbian military and civil officers were to be removed that Austria demanded. Serbia was to permit Austrian officials into Serbia to suppress subversive movements and participate in the investigations against those involved in the assassination of the Archduke. Serbia was to notify the Austro-Hungarian government immediately of Serbia's compliance with the ultimatum. Most foreign officials in Europe agreed that the text of the July ultimatum was formulated to be impossible for Serbia to accept and thus justify Austrian military action against Serbia. Moreover, Serbia only had 48 hours in which to comply with the demands of the ultimatum. Serbia delivered an intentionally ambiguous reply to Austria regarding the ultimatum, making its response sound both like compliance and objection. The further ambiguity left Austria in the lurch, not entirely sure if their demands had been met or not. But Serbia, anticipating the inevitable, mobilized the army for war on July 24th, the day after the ultimatum order was issued. Austria-Hungary broke off diplomatic relations. Emperor Franz Joseph signed a mobilization order for the Imperial Austrian Armed Forces on July 25th. 8 army corps were to begin operations against Serbia. As the diplomatic crisis in the Balkans deteriorated, the president of France, Raymond Poincaré, traveled to St. Petersburg, Russia for a pre-planned diplomatic conference with Tsar Nicholas II. During the conference, France and Russia reaffirmed their alliance and that their alliance extended to supporting Serbia against Austro-Hungarian aggression. Both France and Russia agreed that they would oppose any move by Austria against Serbia. On July 23rd, British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey stated the British government was willing to mediate the crisis. Grey hoped to influence Russia to get Serbia to back down and to influence Germany to get Austria-Hungary to back down so as to avoid a general war. Kaiser William, however, was infuriated by the British offer and labeled it condescending. On July 24th and 25th, the Russian Council of Ministers met. Although several members admitted Russia was not prepared for war and not in a place to take on both Germany and Austria, in an effort to show strength and support for Serbia, the Council of Ministers ordered a partial mobilization of Russian forces against Austria-Hungary. Tsar Nicholas II placed the Russian army on alert on July 25th. Although the move was not a declaration of war, Germany and Austria took it as a sign of Russia's belligerence. Nicholas wrote a letter to Kaiser Wilhelm informing him that Russia was only mobilizing for war against Austria and that he still hoped for peace. Wilhelm's response was to order a German mobilization in lieu of the Russian move. Nicholas was spooked by the Kaiser's actions and canceled the mobilization after an appeal from Wilhelm. A flurry of famous telegrams were sent between the Kaiser and the Tsar in late July into early August. The correspondence is extraordinary because the two correspondents are third cousins and therefore informal, but they are also the heads of large rival states. The Tsar would address a telegram to the Kaiser with the salutation, "Dear Willie." In return, the Kaiser would address the Tsar and his cousin as "Dear Nicky." Even as the friendly correspondence is somewhat humorous, it is also very tragic as the two cousins, even in their private correspondence, could not avert the cataclysmic war approaching Europe. The Russian war minister, Vladimir Sokolunov, was furious with Nicholas for canceling the mobilization and demanded Nicholas reinstate the general mobilization order. Nicholas gave in to the pressure and ordered a general mobilization of Russian forces on July 30th. In response to Russian mobilization, Germany announced its mobilization for war on August 1st, 1914. Mobilization meant something different in Germany than the other nations. To mobilize was to immediately be at war. Thus, last-minute offers by the French and the English to avert war were rejected by Germany. German war plans drafted by the previous and now deceased chair of the German General Staff, Alfred von Schlieffen, required Germany to first invade France through Belgium and knock France out of the war before Germany turned its attention against Russia on the Eastern Front. Helmuth von Moltke, chairman of the German General Staff, now eagerly pushed the Kaiser to implement the Schlieffen Plan and commence military actions to the west towards France. On August 1st, 1914, the British government of Prime Minister Herbert Asquith issued a statement guaranteeing French neutrality. In response, Germany announced its mobilization and delivered an ultimatum to France demanding it renounce its alliance with Russia or face a German invasion. Amid swirling reports that Germany had already attacked Luxembourg and Belgium, French mobilization was ordered on August 1st. On August 1st, German troops attacked Luxembourg, and Germany also declared war on Russia. On August 2nd, the British government promised the Royal Navy would protect France's coast from German attack. Also on August 2nd, Germany issued an ultimatum to Belgium to allow the German army to pass through the Belgian kingdom on its way to France. King Albert of Belgium refused the request as a violation of his kingdom's sovereignty. Germany declared war on France on August 3rd and on Belgium on August 4th, thus violating the Belgian neutrality Germany had earlier promised to uphold. On August 4th, Asquith's government delivered an ultimatum to Germany demanding no further violation of Belgian sovereignty. The German Prime Minister, Bethmann Hollweg, called the 1839 Treaty of London protecting Belgian neutrality nothing more than a, quote, scrap of paper, unquote. On August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war against Germany. On August 6, Emperor Franz Joseph signed the Austrian declaration of war against Russia. Most Europeans were never aware of how quickly the diplomatic situation was deteriorating in the summer of 1914 and what was right around the corner. The major powers of Europe stumbled and bumbled their way into a continental-wide war in the summer of 1914, with none of them realizing the size and scale of the cataclysm into which they were entering. The key short-term causes of the First World War include the assassination of the Archduke, Austria's ultimatum to Serbia, Germany's blank check to Austria promising support, the mobilization of Russia's armed forces, and the German invasion of Belgium. Although it may be easy for historians to look back and identify key causes of the conflict, the war would become so encompassing and engrossing to nations around the world that at the time, many would fail to remember what the war was about in the first place. The collapse of Europe into war in the summer of 1914 would provide a bitter lesson for heads of state for many years to come on the tragic consequences that occur when localized disputes become international disputes. Perhaps a quote that best captures the dark and pivotal moment that Europe found itself in August of 1914 was spoken by the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey. On Monday evening, August 3rd, the night before Britain declared war against Germany, Grey and a friend were standing near a window in Grey's office in the Foreign Office building in London. At dusk, a man was lighting the gas lamps that lit the street below. As Grey watched the lights below, he remarked, quote, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." Unquote. Grey's words were prescient as much as they were tragic. Indeed, the European continent would never be the same after the cataclysm that was the First World War. The grandeur and the prosperity of Europe that was the envy of the world in the previous century would all be thrown away, along with an entire generation of the young on the battlefields of Europe.